Welcome everyone. I'm never sure at 12 whether it's morning or afternoon. I suppose it's afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the first of these webinars on Audience of the Future, the Demonstrator competition. So I'm Andrew Chitty, I'm the Interim Challenge Director, and also on the webinar we have Fiona Kilkelly, who many of you will know, Overlord of Immerse UK and the Creative Industries Lead from the KTN. And Phillip, Haddow and Joe Lyford, and I think you might be able to see Phillip, but Joe will apparently appear at some point within this webinar to answer questions. So Phillip and Joe are from the Innovate UK competitions team. So there's lots of questions that we've had in which are of a very technical nature about the form. So they'll be helping us out with this one. So just to run through the plan of what we're going to try and cover so running order, we're assuming that we'll take an hour. If we run out of your questions before an hour, we will let you all go. So what we're going to do is just, Fiona and I are going to do a little bit of a status review of where we think we're going since the launch of the competition and all the events where we met many of you. So we'll do that for about 15 minutes, just reflecting on where we think people are at, the themes that are coming out, general tenor of questions. Everything will be anonymous unless we make some kind of dreadful mistake. And similarly, the questions that you ask in this session will also be anonymous. We'll not be seeking to identify anybody. And we think that's not appropriate at this stage. If at subsequent webinars, if people want to identify themselves, maybe we should think about that. So then we've got a few identified topics that we've had questions submitted in before. So particularly around applicable costs and match funding, research status, charity status, things like that. Quite a few questions around IP and rights. We're getting more questions in as we speak. So please, if you have questions, go to the Q&A box and submit them. Sam Michelle will be trying to make sure that we collect those. And also if things are answered by, because there's lots of overlapping questions, I think, we'll take them out of the list and we'll try and work down as many as we can during the session. Then after we've done those, the ones we've already got identified, which we'll run through, then we've got open Q&A. So that's questions you're submitting now that we haven't seen before. And then hopefully we'll get nearly half an hour on that. And then quickly some next steps, which will probably be about when we're going to do another one of these. So let's go status review. Fiona, I suppose we've had quite a lot of contact there's some really exciting ideas out there. What do you think is a useful messages as to where you think we're at in terms of runners and riders and where people are at in terms of of developing their proposals?
Thanks, Andrew. Well, because we're pretty much at the coalface dealing with business inquiries and inquiries in general around Audience of the Future, there's a lot of activity right now with people trying to identify the right partners to work with. So looking around the UK to find within the value chain for their ideas, what bits are missing and where they need to find a new partner, whether that's for to plug in a bit of niche technology or somebody who's got access to the market. So supporting people and helping identifying where within that value chain they can fit the right people to put together the best consortia possible. So at this stage, not a huge amount of focus around what the actual idea is and fleshing out the details of the idea. At this point, people are trying to get the key partners in place. And that could be anything from really large agencies to smaller independent production companies who are working in immersive, either being commissioned to do pieces or doing their own research and development. Some national organizations with a national remit, lots of researchers and universities, a very broad range of people from quite large to quite small, and some interesting consortia developing with a mixture of all of that. So there's kind of no general rule, but very much a focus on consortia building at this point. And we are hoping the idea development, the development of what the consortia will be putting in is happening once those consortia are bedded down more clearly.
Okay, I think that's absolutely right, and it's probably going to be borne out by a lot of the questions in this in this webinar that we're going to answer is that they are rather organisational. They are rather about the funding mechanisms and things like that. But it's probably worth saying to everybody that in the end, what we're asking people to do is innovate in terms of the audience proposition and the technology and the business layer. We're not going to. Nobody's going to get any funding for innovative consortium building or bringing together, an interesting bunch of people. I think it's probably worth saying that the kind of big ticket item is the proposition itself, and it's inevitable that in the first couple of weeks, I think you've got to get your ducks in a row who you're going to work with, but it is really important that people then push on with that, with building the audience proposition, which is it's all about. I think one of the other things that we've probably both had is particularly people being interested, particularly on the SME side, but also on the bigger kind of institutional IP owner side, is not quite knowing how to reach out to the research community, or connectivity there is perhaps a little bit lacking. Do you want to say a bit about that, Fiona? Because I think within this area, there's some real strengths. There's some great labs out there. There are some great there's some great research teams that have been working in this area for a really long time. So they have knowledge that people might not be familiar with.
Yeah.
Do you think that's true? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we're very happy to help in that space. Anybody who's looking for a research component, if they want to contact us and just specify what type of research in what areas, if it's in what part of the UK they want to work with, or if they've got a particular geographical focus, as much details as possible. And between us and the ICF team who run the demonstrators, we can reach out to the wider research community with that call to action and see who responds.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that certainly from the conversations I've had with some people is what can people expect out of research? So I think there's very different requirements that the research community can respond to. So in the kind of technology of immersion space, there are teams that have got access to both, and not so much what's happening now, but what's happening in the future. So real technology advances. But there are also people who've been embedded within the problems of, say, live performance and doing those on a distributed level for audiences for many years. There's a bunch of people who also have real insight into HCI, design, perception kind of issues, and also behavioural insights. And it's interesting that several people have mentioned to me the idea of using researchers to develop the business aspects of propositions as well, and business models, which, again, I think there are people out there who can do all of those things. So I think, as Fiona says, if people can contact us, if they feel they have a need, and we obviously in the construction of that competition feel there is there's real value that that the research base can apply, then contact us with as many details as possible. The other thing I was thinking about, Fiona, is, and again, it may represent where we're at in the development pathway. It's quite early into, even though it's a very short period, is particularly in the consortia events, we started to talk about the aspiration that people should have in these in the final propositions to not just do one thing or benefit one institution or rights holder, or create a magnificent thing that's a single thing, but also we have expectations for this kind of money of people's ability to lift the sector. So do you think, I think people aren't quite at that stage yet, but how do you think people should start to think about putting together propositions that can deliver on that? So in terms of the kind of shape of the consortium.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it really is about kind of beyond the current state of the art, really, about what is the kind of ideal consortia that can help develop something that you cannot otherwise do or develop, because you wouldn't have necessarily access to the R&D money at this early stage, without having to prove return on investment or any commercial outputs. What could you do? What would that dream team look like to lift the state of the art in what we have in terms of immersive experiences today in this space? And I think to be ambitious about that and to look at it as, particularly through the lens of, as we've always said, that this is about audiences and this is about global audiences. So what does that mean in terms of international reach as well, not just in a very focused, localized context?
Okay, cool. I think that's probably, enough from us. I think we're very well aware that our knowledge of what you're all doing is imperfect. If there are things that that you think either Immerse UK or the ISCF team can help with or provide at least a sounding board for, then please do communicate with us, because the more we know about what's going on, the more we can respond kind of flexibly and appropriately. But that's probably enough of our kind of overview. So I guess the next point is going on to some of the questions that we've had already. So let's start off with match funding. So we've got some interesting questions that we've had submitted here. Philip, this is please feel free to come in now. So match funding. So this is a spiky one. I am expected to operate at a loss if only a percentage of my costs are covered. Isn't that unrealistic? So I think what this refers to, and I'm assuming that what we've got here is someone who's not, as I hope a lot of people in this competition are, haven't done Innovate UK funding proposals before, and is looking at the percentage funding and thinking that that because it's 70% for an SME or 60% for a medium-sized company or so on, that they're losing money on that. Now, actually, I don't think that's the intention at all, is it? So can you take that on, Philip?
Yeah, of course. So I think that's kind of framing it in the wrong kind of context, because what we're kind of proposing with the kind of audience future competition is to fund projects that, due to state aid rules, we can't fund the entire project. So we're saying we will fund 70%, and then the intention is that you'll go to industry, or you'll go and find partners or funders who can match the other 30% or 40% for you. I understand that this might be a bit of a strain on some of the SMEs involved, but it's kind of the rules tying our hands. So it's not asking you to operate at a loss, but it's asking, because obviously this is money that is going towards the project, it's asking you to source some of it yourself. I'm not sure if my colleague Joe, who's actually just sat a metre this way, would have anything to add into that.
Joe, you've just appeared on our screens, I think, so please come in.
I have, yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to the state aid rules that we use for most of our Innovate UK competitions, and businesses get a certain grant intervention rate depending on their size and also the type of research that the project looks to address. That's just the way it is, really. So the remaining percentage, depending on whether you're obviously a small, medium or large business, is what we call match funding, and that's your contribution to the project, and that will have to be money that you find yourselves, essentially.
So I suppose it's worth saying, certainly in a previous life, having run SMEs and been in receipt of Innovate UK funding for R&D programs, I think there is a kind of custom and practice here where it's very beneficial to the SME. This isn't an unreasonable. This isn't an unreasonable model, and many people find it works for them. So I think what people need to do, probably, if they're new to the competition, and we may think about running a specific webinar, I think, about people who are new, and perhaps inviting some people in who have done, who've undertaken projects like this to talk about how they do it, is particularly thinking about how you calculate costs. So there is a cost model, and indeed there's an overhead calculator, isn't there, used by Innovate UK for these programs. I actually just want to talk a little bit about that, because it's really important how you calculate what costs are allowable. So two questions that we've had is what's covered by costs? Is there a definition? So that's allowable costs. And perhaps specifically, if you could talk a little bit about how overheads are calculated within costs.
So yeah, for the first question on kind of what are allowable costs, we've actually got a guidance document which I can probably arrange to send out to everyone who's attending today. But kind of the eligible costs are broken down on our application into labour, overheads, materials, subcontracting, travel and subsistence, and I think other costs. And these all have to be costs directly incurred by the project. And there are things that we do deem as ineligible. So, for example, we won't fund any contingency money. In labour, we won't fund any performance-related pay. So I will liaise with Sam about getting this document to you all. It's worth looking through just to make sure. But the more kind of the important points are it has to be cost incurred during the project period. So any money you spend before you've got the official sign-off from us would not be considered eligible, and you wouldn't be able to claim that back afterwards. So, Joe, I'm not sure if you've got anything to add to that.
No, I think that's it really. That's obviously covers the cost categories that we got. And as Philip mentioned, there is plenty of guidance available within our website, and also when you'd be working on your application as well, as to what is eligible and what isn't. So it's obviously there available for you to use. And if you do have any questions, then you can just get in touch and we can let you know anything about your costs.
Yeah,
okay.
Of course.
Just before, I mean, we may get some subsequent questions coming in, but just in terms, before we leave the ones that have been submitted so far, there's one interesting one here, which I think we covered in some of the events, but perhaps not either people that weren't at those events or didn't catch it. What's the minimum amount that can be claimed? It's an interesting question.
Minimum amount. Yeah. Some competitions do have a minimum amount of grant. Let me just have a quick look at the numbers. But
I don't think
there's a minimum for this competition. Some competitions do, but this one doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah, so the guidance for this actually stipulates that you can claim up to £4 million in grant, but there is no lower limit. Although it does say that we would expect costs to be between 5 million and 10 million, and obviously your grant is going to be dependent on your cost essentially. So there's going to be a bit of variety, but no lower limit as such. Okay,
Fiona, I think one of the things about the reasons we didn't put a lower limit in was because of we want to encourage international partners in who can't claim the grant, but can contribute.
Yeah. That's right.
Okay, do you want to expand on that at all? You're worried about your battery, aren't you?
I'm worried. Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I think if anybody has a international partner that they want to work with, it'd actually be really worth having an individual conversation around that, because there's usually quite a bespoke conversation. And I wouldn't like to say one size fits all, because it depends on who the international partner is and what exactly they're looking to do within the consortia itself. So anybody who's up for that, let us know, and we'll definitely have a conversation with you. Okay, so actually, interestingly, we've got, before leaving this area, we've got the very first question that we've had in. He's around this area, and I do wonder if it's actually somebody who's put in a question before, but anonymous attendee says, here's our understanding. So let's listen to this and see if it brings out any points that we haven't covered. An organisation in a consortium can claim for their costs to be covered by government funding. I think that sounds right. From a staffing point of view, the amount of these costs is basically worked out by taking the salary of an employee working on the project, adding any other costs such as NI, pension, etc. Well, I think we've already said that in addition to that, there is an overhead calculator as well. Depending on your size, you can claim up to 70% of those costs. That's correct. First question, is the above understanding correct? So I think unless anybody thinks otherwise, my reaction to that would be broadly correct, yes, but with the exception of overhead. And I seem to remember in the past, there always used to be the choice of an overhead calculator or do it yourself, to which the overhead calculators always seemed a simpler response. So second question, am I right in thinking that therefore the organisation of the consortium being asked to work at a loss while working on the project for 2 years? When you combine this with the fact that the first payment will not be received by organisation until roughly 4 months into the project, that means people are asked to bankroll the project for a third of a year, and then only being able to receive a maximum of 70% of their costs. For some smaller organisations, that could be quite crippling. Any advice on how to address this? Well, it's something we'll come on to talk about later, about
whether if you are a very small organisation, you should be a subcontractor rather than a partner. If you find those terms crippling. But I think that the other thing is to look at your budget and look at your costs and look at what you're getting out of the project in return. And perhaps, again, we might think about doing some worked examples for another webinar. Any other thoughts on that? I mean, I think it's the same questions coming from the same place, let's say, as the questions we've had before. So actually, Fiona, you know, with your work at the KTN, you've dealt with probably hundreds of SMEs who've received funding.
Yeah. So our point of response to that would be, usually when you've got a project hugely de-risked by having grant funding or Innovate UK funding, it makes the job much easier of finding that match funding more than you may have experienced in the past. So having conversations with people about finding that match happens a lot easier, a lot quicker when you've got a hugely de-risked project with such a significant amount of public investment in it. And it is standard grant funding that its payment is in arrears, and there's nothing that can be done about that. And it's just part of the way that the funding is structured. And we recognise that may be difficult for small organisations, but your point is absolutely right, Andrew. If you're not at the scale to be able to bankroll that, then maybe you should be looking at subcontracting rather than being a partner or a lead.
Right, okay, and we'll come on to subcontracting, I think, as a separate point, because we've got a number of questions coming in on that. Should we just talk about, we've got loads of questions in on types of funding before we leave this, and classifications. So where should we go first? Let's go for one of the ones submitted beforehand. So research and public funding. So this is different types of classification. So am I classified as a research organisation, although I am a business undertaking research? Separately, we've got what is a research organisation. So who wants to provide a definition there? I'm not looking at volunteers at the moment. So
if you're a business undertaking research, you're still an SME, but a research organisation is a university or a not-for-profit or a charity who does research as part of its day-to-day business. Yeah,
so I think that's the crucial point, isn't it? It does do research as part of its day-to-day organisation. It's not just that it's it's a charity. So, for instance, although it's not applicable in this, all NHS trusts are counted as research organisations by the research councils. But there are also a list, so it's all universities are research organisations, and there are also a list of independent research organisations across the different sectors the research councils work from. So that would include the National Physical Laboratory, it would include the major museums, it would include the BFI as an IRO, and so on. So I think on the first one, probably know whether you're a business or a research organisation. The important thing about this competition, though, of course, is research organisations can't lead it. It has to be business-led. So I've got another one here. As we are a charity, we would be eligible for 100% funding. Is this correct? And subsidiary question, and therefore theoretically we could submit a £4 million project and get all of that paid. Is that correct? So who would like to take on the first part of that? We're a charity, we'd be eligible for 100% funding. Is that correct? Joe?
That is correct, yeah. And in terms of actually getting the 100% funding, that is correct that you would get your project costs covered by a grant, but the grant would still be paid quarterly in arrears. So obviously the first quarter of your project, your costs, you would have to essentially pay for yourself up to the end of the first quarter, and then you get the grant paid back. So you still need some funding in place to actually cover the first quarter of your project.
Yeah, I think though there's therefore theoretically we could submit a £4 million project and get all of that paid. Now actually I think that's not correct.
No.
Because charity research organisations, including charities, can't lead, and we require that these are consortia which also have an SME in it. So nobody's going to get £4 million, 100%. To one organisation. Is that right? Oh, that's Philip. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So that's absolutely correct, because like you say, it needs to be a consortium. So there will have to be one business in there, and then the businesses can't get 100%. So I think as well for this competition, I'm not sure if Joe will be able to confirm this for me. I think research organisations might be restricted to 30% of the funding anyway. So it might be businesses have to incur 70% of the project cost. But I can just double check this and confirm it for everyone.
That's right. So a research organisation would get 30% of the total budget, but 100% of that would be covered at a maximum of 30% of the project cost.
And that rather brilliantly, thank you, Fiona, answers one of the other questions that we've had in, as it were, the 30% issue. So hopefully that's pretty clear. Few more on this issue of funding. So one of the questions is around match funding. Is non-grant public funding, and I think this is very specific, so the example that's given in the question is lottery funding. Is this eligible as match funding? Now, I think this is an interesting one for our sector, because there are a couple of large lottery distributors within the sector, and the question is, I suppose, is, as it is in this question, is this lottery funding public funding or not?
I'm not actually sure. So I think what I'd suggest in this case is that they email into our support desk, because we can get somebody from our project finance team who knows this kind of stuff inside and out to give a very bespoke answer, because this sounds like it's a very specific case and I'd hate to give the wrong advice. I'm not sure if Joe agrees with me on this.
Yes, we don't know for sure whether that constitutes public funding or not, but if it does, then it wouldn't be you wouldn't be able to use that as part of your match funding, because then that would be in breach of state aid rules of the competition. So your rate, your grant rate could go from 70% to 100%, for example, and obviously for a business that's not allowed. So if it is public funding that you're looking to use match funding, then unfortunately you're not able to do that.
Yeah, so as I say, again, I think we've, this is one that's kind of fairly, probably sets a precedent. We do have to kind of get an absolute ruling on this, because lottery funding, I think that the two questions are, is lottery funding public funding, in that it doesn't derive from general taxation, it derives from the public. So that's a kind of interesting distinction. We need to know the ramifications of that. I think the other complicating factor is that we have several organisations who may be partners in these consortia who are both public funders, distributors of public funds, and distributors of lottery funding. So I think the commitment there, guys, is we have to take this away and get a kind of definitive ruling on it. I think some of the people, possibly people on online at the moment, can help us with that, because some of those institutions probably consider these definitions of public funding in their own activities. So we may have to call other people in there. So we've got another one here, which is, again, I think, a very interesting one, given the makeup of the sector and particularly some of the themes that we've talked about. So this is around the issue of publicly funded organisations and how they approach their participation in these demonstrator consortia, because they have the choice of separating, of coming in as publicly funded organisations, perhaps as IROs, if they're that as well, or coming in as businesses because they have commercial trading arms as well. So I guess what people are asking is, have we got any thoughts on the ramifications? I don't think we can recommend which route they do, of the ramifications of, say, if you were a major gallery that also has a trading arm. Do you come in as the publicly funded? What are the consequences of that? And if you come in, if you were instead to take it through the commercial trading arm as a business? Who'd like to have a stab at that one?
I guess the key difference there is, if you were to come in as a genuine public sector organisation, then you could claim up to 100% of your costs for the work that you're carrying out, but you could only incur up to 30% of the cost of the project. Whereas if you were to come in as a commercial business, you'd have to match fund some of your contribution, but you could therefore incur the total project cost of up to 70%. So it's to do with how much work and what your share is going to be of the total project across the consortium.
Okay, I think that's very clear. Is there also, do you think, a distinction between, if you come in as a publicly funded organisation or an IRO, there are responsibilities to disseminate material, whereas if you come in as the private business, then perhaps you can be a little more protective around your IP?
Yeah. I was going to add to that, Andrew. I think it really, I think what people are often falling into a trap of trying to see how the money and budget works, which I completely understand, because that's critically important for people before they look at committing and exploring how a consortia work for them. But I think to start at the point of where is the best fit in terms of what they want this project to look like, and where can this consortium partner add the most value over and above any other consortia, what's going to make them more competitive, and ultimately what's going to put them in a better position to get the money, fit the consortia partners around that, rather than the way in which the money would work. And then that's not going to work out, well then maybe that's not the right partnership to have within the consortia itself. So
consortia design first has to be the kind of overwhelming factor. Okay, I buy that. So we started to touch on IP there. We've got lots of questions about IP. So let's see if we can try and do a quick fire round. Does the project need to be centered around existing IP? Okay, I'll do quick fire on that. Well, that's what we said in all the briefings and in the scope. So I don't think anybody have changed our minds around that. I think, though, it's important to remember what we did say, which was access to, participation with, or use of a globally recognised IP or cultural or creative brand. So it wasn't that we were suggesting that everybody have to do a spin-off of a created piece of IP. There's a little bit more subtlety to it than that, but we did say that as an expectation. Here's another one. Can the project money go towards rights clearance? Any new project around existing IP will have to have new rights cleared with significant fees and conditions attached to that, unless someone has already brought out all universal rights in perpetuity, which is not something that we can do. So, what do we think about paying for rights?
I think it would, I don't think we'd probably like to see a huge amount of money within that proposal going towards rights clearances, because I think in terms of value for money, it's going to drain a lot of the money that can be actually driven towards new innovative R&D around IP.
Yeah, no, so I think I feel similarly about that, Fiona. I think also, what if you were looking at a rights owner that wanted to be paid for access to them to their IP for use in this new, one, pre-commercial environment, and two, one of future value, it would suggest to me that they aren't bought in enough to the idea or the field to think that they're going to get value out of the work. I mean, it would seem so that's another reason. I think Fiona's absolutely right. It would take money away from actually doing the R&D. But the other thing is, it suggests that the IP owner would not be convinced. And actually, we should be able to convince IP owners that this is an exciting and they're going to get benefit from it too. Other IP questions. Can we use international IP? I'm assuming that means non-UK owned IP. Fiona?
Yes.
That it? You're the mistress of the short answer at the moment.
I think in terms of working with international partnerships, I think what needs to be demonstrated is that the value of that R&D, well, the R&D will happen in the UK, and some of that value will remain in the UK. Okay.
Leading on from that is a kind of other international kind of things that we talked about. So, to what extent can the project engage with international audiences during the project, and to what extent can the results of the project be exploited internationally afterwards?
I think that's a really interesting critical part of a consortia that's in development. I think it's up to the consortia partners, as is quite a lot of answers to some of the questions coming in, is that there often isn't a one-size-fits-all in terms of providing some solutions to this. But that would be up to the consortia partners as to how they want to work with an international partner. But back to the point which I made, which was you need to demonstrate that R&D would happen in the UK and that the value would generate value to the UK economy.
Okay, and two last ones from the pre-submissions about IP ownership. So this is quite an interesting, I think, and I think that these two are connected. So, to what level of rights ownership or access are we expecting, and does that agreement need to be in place before submission? Now, I know that this is an area that I've had people contact me about in some detail. So perhaps shall I take this one on?
Yeah.
So I think that what you've got to have, if you go, is so that in terms of the level of rights ownership, you need to be able to employ the IP in the ways that you want to do it. You need to have the freedom to operate. So, and that means the freedom to operate to also do something that includes a public trial. So this is not closed R&D. This is R&D out in the open. Our requirements that you find an audience of 100,000 require you to do things live in the world. So you're going to need fundamentally the freedom to do that. Now, I think there are questions as to, in this field, in immersive, are those rights locked up in existing rights agreements? They probably are. In some cases, and they probably aren't in others. So do we need to have an agreement in place before submission? I think we need to have you need to identify the position as it currently exists in your submission and what you are going to do about that to acquire the rights that you need. I think, do we expect a signed rights agreement by the 1st of August? That would be nice, and it would give assessors a lot of confidence if you were able to do that. If you can't do that, because the timescale is vital, you know, the timescale is unmovable and it is very short, then if you can't do that, you have to lay out the position where you want to get to. And I think the thing is, you will be required to achieve that level of agreement before a project gets the final go-ahead and before any financial commitments are made by Innovate UK. So go as far as you can, set out the plan. We'll definitely need that. We don't want, I think assessors would have a very low level of confidence if people said, we will acquire these rights to do this before we start. But there is a little bit of leeway between, you know, a final legal agreement, which would have to be put in place before we start. So that's probably enough on that.
Andrew, sorry, we had just one quick question on that. Sam here. Hello.
Yeah. Hello, Sam.
Hello. I was asking if any generated IP could fall under the Lambert model agreements.
So these are Lambert model agreement, collaboration agreements, aren't they? I think that's not a bad place to start with your collaboration agreements. I think the Lambert model probably does apply. We're not making it compulsory. But yes, how resultant IP is dealt with, again, we'll want to see your strategy in your submission, but we'll expect a completed collaboration agreement before you get any money. Anybody got anything else to add on suitability of Lamberts?
Yep, that's spot on, I think.
Okay, again, going quick fire, nearly got through all the ones that we've had beforehand. So in what circumstances can consortia charge for trial activities?
So I think we had this question through our customer service desk, and the answer was that they can charge for activities, but we would expect it to be taken out of their costs. Hold on just a sec. I'll just bring up the answer as exactly, so I'm not giving any false information. So yeah, there'd be some expectation to test. We appreciate that you'll be testing kind of the appetite for these solutions of a public audience and how much they'll be prepared to pay for it. But it needs to be reduced from your project costs, because we can't be funding that under state aid rules.
But just to be clear there, Philip, so effectively revenue from public, let's call it ticketing, for want of a better word, would be a match funding, essentially. So you'd have your total project costs, and they would be considered as match funding into the project.
I'm not 100% sure on that one. I'm not sure if Joe's got any thoughts, but just part of me says I can't see why not, because obviously it's going to be income into the company that they can use. But I'm not sure. What do you think, Joe?
I believe the policy is that any revenue generated directly as a result of your project during the project timeframe itself needs to be deducted from the project costs, and therefore it wouldn't necessarily be regarded as match funding, because obviously your costs would be reduced, and therefore your match funding rate would just be a proportion of what the total cost then become. So it wouldn't be regarded as match funding in itself.
So that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because that would mean it doesn't actually appear in any of the figures that are presented on the budget form.
So in the past, I've seen this, and I think it's in the other cost section of project costs, they have inserted, I think you can insert a minus figure, which is obviously representative of any revenue that you're going to generate as a result of your project. So it just comes off the total. Okay,
so what I'd suggest there is that, because we don't want to discourage people from doing this, because as Philip said earlier, it's something we'd expect people to do and want them to do. So should we try and work through a kind of one of these hypothetical worked examples of how this might work? I think that, and present that in a future webinar or as a document or something. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think so.
How are we defining audiences? So we've got quite a few on this. Can the 100,000 figure be cumulative? That's a quick one, because we've already responded to that. So the 100,000 figure can be cumulative across the period. How will we be auditing this? So we've got how are we defining audiences and how we'll be auditing it. Fiona, I don't know if you got things to add to this, but what I'd say at the outset is what we'd like everybody in their submission to do is describe how they're going to get to their 100,000 audience, what they count as their audience, what they're going to collect data on, and therefore give us the data to audit it. So basically the answer to all these questions is you tell us.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Do we think? Okay, right. Now I've got some just on consortia, and this is where we go partner and subcontractor. So here's one I think for Philip and Joe. Partners or subcontractors, what are the pros and cons of going down each route? And I think we said in some of the meetings and presentations we did that there were issues over substantial levels of subcontracting. So what do we count as substantial levels of subcontracting?
There's not actually a defined, there's no strict parameter in place for levels of subcontracting. I think typically we would say that anything higher than about 30% of the total project costs is quite high in terms of the subcontract amount. And I guess in terms of the disadvantages, I think it's in relation to things such as IP. I think if you come in as a subcontractor, you're less able to perhaps take a fair share of the IP generated from the project. But obviously, as a subcontractor, you're simply paid you're paid for doing a piece of work. So, in essence, you get paid, I guess, to do the piece of work, and you don't have to contribute any match funding as such.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fairly clear. I think there's also possibly, and I may correct me if I've got this wrong. There's an anxiety about seeing large companies as subcontractors. I know that that's been an issue in certain areas that I've worked in the past, say the healthcare sector, where large companies have thought it might be advantageous financially to become subcontractors or consultants to a project rather than project partners.
Yeah, it'd probably be questioned by the assessors. And another thing to add on the subcontractors is that obviously if an organisation comes in as a subcontractor, it might be beneficial for them because they're getting paid just to do a piece of work. But obviously, whoever is a partner in a project takes the hit because they then have them as part of their subcontract costs, which obviously increases their cost and therefore increases the level of match funding that they need to provide.
Okay, great. So we're moving towards the things that we're picking up online. So first one, consortium. Do we have to have a university involved, Fiona?
You don't have to. That's up to around the needs of the project, but it might be useful to see how research is going to play out within the proposal if a business or another type of research organisation is going to undertake that.
Yep. What size of consortiums are we expecting? Interesting phrase.
Do you want to take that, Andrew, or should I?
Well, I don't think we have expectations above what we've said, which is you need the concise. If size means the number of people involved, obviously the minimum size is 2. But I'd be very surprised if anybody can achieve the other bit of the project that other requirements with only 2 people. Stand to be corrected. I think particularly hard is the desire to have a strategy to lift the whole sector and disseminate the results. That's really quite hard if you're just, say, one IP owner and one company. That sounds more like a production to me than it does as an R&D consortium. Does the IP holder have to be a partner? It's an interesting question, I suppose, because you've got to prove that you have access to the IP. I think, again, it speaks back to one of the other questions we've had, which is if they're not a partner, so they don't expect to get things out of it, they might think about charging you for the IP, which suggests that they're not a partner. Do they have to draw down funds is separate from being a partner, I think. Okay, right, so let's see what we've got online that we haven't dealt with. Any suggestions on how to deal with potential conflict of interest of participants and partners that are brought into the consortia? There's so little time before the deadline to iron things out. So I do think this is hard. I do think it's probably something about your strategy to deal with that as through a collaboration agreement. Fiona, it's unlikely that they'll get everything nailed in this timescale. What would you advise?
Well, I think there's going to be some toing and froing and conversation, and whether that conversation turns into conflict is probably better to be nipped in the bud earlier on, because you obviously want to have partners that you are confident and able to work with. But there is going to be expected high levels of negotiation and toing and froing. They shouldn't necessarily always arise in a situation which bring about conflict. If there does seem to you or feels like that by the end of, but very close to deadline for submission, you're having problems with one of your partners, I would just take a pause and rethink, or make the submission. There is, as you pointed out earlier, time to negotiate post-submission going in, but we'd want to still be pretty confident that you're happy working with the partners that you brought on board.
Okay, cool, thank you. Is there more of an emphasis on public-facing activity, i.e. on the ground, doing things face-to-face, or on making experiences available online? This has a big impact on how costs are worked out, as public-facing activity is expensive. I think, again, this is one of it depends on what the program and the project is. In some areas, I think it'll be hard to do stuff that isn't face-to-face. It'll be hard to do visitor experience without visitors and things like that. So I think that one is not answerable by us, but only kind of answerable by whoever is putting together the proposal, coming up with the right balance of activity to achieve the requirements. Yeah. And it will depend on the approach they take. So I think that sounds a tricky one for us to answer. So here's one for Phillip and Joe. Does the 30% match funding have to be available on day one of the project, or can it come in during its lifetime?
So it can come in during its lifetime. So if you were to be successful in this competition, then we would carry out finance checks on you to ensure that you can meet your financial obligations. You wouldn't necessarily need to demonstrate up front that you've got all of the money in place, but certainly we would look for assurance that you've got the first quarter of the project covered in terms of the cost, because obviously the grant is paid in arrears. So as long as you can demonstrate that you've got the money in place to finance the first quarter on your own before you get any grant, then that's probably going to be that will be fine.
Okay, I think of course these are going to be quite big projects, and we're funding a limited range of them. So, accepting totally what you say, again, in the proposal, the more certainty you have on match funding, probably the higher you get scored. I think it's fair to say. Can you just expand a little bit for people who haven't done this before about what kind of financial checks that you do before projects given go ahead?
Yeah, so there are two different types of checks that we would carry out. The first is what we call a viability check, and that's to do with the match funding. So just to have a look at usually, previous company accounts to see whether you've actually got the money in place to finance your share of the project. So it's just really a case of show us the money type of thing, really. And if we did have any questions on that area, then we would get in touch with you and ask essentially for evidence that you've got that money in place, whether it's from existing cash reserves or potentially a loan that you've got in place for the project. Those sort of things we would ask for. And we would also carry out what's called an eligibility check, which is where we would look at what you've put in your project costs to make sure that they're compliant with the competition and state aid criteria that's in place. And again, if there were any questions on any of the items that you've included, then we would be in touch to ask you further information on any of them.
Cool, thank you. No, I think that's really helpful, because we have to bear in mind there are people in this audience who may even lead these very big projects who haven't been received Innovate funding before. Okay, quick one. This is one for you, Fiona. Are there any particular immersive technologies that have a priority ranking in terms of appeal for the funding?
No, it's up to you to understand what technology is available to you or what technology you would like to develop best suited to the project you have in development. Yeah,
and I think we've been we've said before, we're very broad in our approach to what immersive technologies are applicable. I think it's worth saying, probably, it's no secret that the projected value of this sector is VR for the next few years, and after that, AR and MR. So that's worth bearing in mind in terms of your closeness to market. How many demonstrations are expected for the £4 million demonstrators? For example, 3 different sites, and how many partners? Again, I think this is one. The number of partners that you require are the number of partners you require to do it. I think we could imagine probably programs that have one massive demonstration at the end of it, or one massive audience proposition. But we could equally well imagine things that are cumulatively over time to achieve those 100,000. So moving on, just to clarify, are subcontractor costs covered at 70% or 100%? I think we've covered this, but for the avoidance of doubt, Joe and Philip, subcontractor costs are covered at?
Well, essentially 100%, but they don't actually receive any grant because they just form part of the costs of an official partner who does receive grant.
Cool.
But they wouldn't have to necessarily provide match funding, no.
No. Are there any rules about the 100,000 figure and how it will be measured, e.g. ticket sales for a performance? I don't think there are any rules, are there, Fiona, yet?
I think we've covered that already, by you saying demonstrate the figures and demonstrate how it will be measured, whether that's through ticket sales or a performance.
Okay, I've got one question here that I don't quite, it looks like it's been cut off. So if I read it out, do you have a list of partners or funders who have participated in the funding of previous Innovate projects? And it goes on to say something, but we don't know what. So can somebody please expand that? Because I think we need to know the purpose that you're asking for.
But could I pitch in there, Andrew, quickly? On the Immerse UK website, there's an online guide to funding and finance, which captures a lot of the other public funders who are available, who do fund immersive tech, and a lot of the private investors who do. So it's a good starting point to identify who's in this market and good people to talk to.
You're absolutely right. It is, of course, the place to start for anything around this competition. Are there any restrictions at all in the form the match funding comes in? Or is it at the sole discretion of the consortium? Again, I'm not quite sure what that means. The form the match funding comes in. I imagine money or kind of British pounds at some point. I don't think it's at the sole discretion of the consortium. I think we've touched on some of the things that govern whether match funding is eligible. So again, if we haven't quite captured that, it feels like we've answered that, but to the extent we can. If not, could the person who asked that kind of sharpen it up a little bit so to what they actually need to know? At this stage, calculations on costs are primarily done by using hourly rates. Do we have expectation around hourly rates? That's really interesting. Philip, Joe, this is coming your way. Will you want to see proof of salary to support daily rate cost calculations? Is there an approved factor calculation between salary and daily rate? Philip, you're on.
So for salaries, we would expect them to be in line with the industry at large. So we might get them checked by yourself or someone else who knows what the kind of standard is. So if it was incredibly high, we would probably ask for some kind of proof or some reassurance that this was kind of your regular day-to-day rate, didn't include any benefits or anything like that. And then it's all kind of evidenced through timesheets, and this will be checked at quarterly monitoring to make sure that the amount that you're getting paid matches your PAYE records. So I'm not sure if Joe's got anything to kind of add on there.
That's pretty much it, really. All costs have to be actual, verifiable costs, and you have to be able to prove that you've actually incurred and defrayed them. In terms of labour costs, you'll enter your figures into IFS, and it will calculate the daily rate for you. But all costs have to be actual, so you can't just pluck a number out of thin air, so to speak.
Okay, I think that's helpful. Slight change in tack. Fiona, I think this one's an interesting one for you. Large corporations may also have problems approving match funding in such a short time before the submission deadline. That is almost certainly an accurate observation that we do understand. What do we suggest people do about that?
I think we touched on it already, in that there will be a period of time post-award to help clarify and bed down what their participation. I think a large corporate might be more incentivized to participate if they know that you've been awarded the money. It might help them speed up their negotiation and get to where they need to be to participate. But the advice we're giving people is just be very realistic about that.
Yeah. Then we got a couple again about this issue about subcontracting, and I think again people maybe there's a risk here of overthinking things. So somebody said, why would anybody, if you're subcontractor, you get funded at 100%, why would anybody want to be a consortium member? And I think that's been explained, that anything, once you get over 30% of subcontracting, it starts to look inappropriate. So somebody has to lead this consortium, and other people have to be partners in it. So there's a limit. This one perhaps is overthinking. Can a subcontractor donate their fees? So while the consortium made up of small businesses can only save 70%, the fees of the subcontractor can be 100% funded, and the amount used as a contribution towards the match funding element that the consortium has to make. I think that's really overthinking it. I think there's much simpler way through that to guess who is going to benefit, their partners, and who needs to be a subcontractor who won't, as Joe said earlier, have access to the IP. So I think these very kind of complex arrangements are possibly at the expense of trying to work out how the consortium is equitable. Can a loan or advance against future revenues from the demonstrator be match funding? That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because essentially what you're saying is, can a company match future or current profits, and the question is underwriting them in the meantime, as their match funding? I would have said that's exactly what most people do.
Yeah.
So yeah, as part of the evidence that we would look for in our viability checks, it could be kind of company accounts and details like that to show that as the project goes on, that other business activity will be bringing in that funding, which will then be used to match fund the project. So I'd agree, yeah.
Related to that, and I think this is very on point, this one. For businesses applying, does match mean cash match, or can in-kind funding entirely be considered?
It has to be hard cash. We don't accept in-kind contributions as part of match funding or any project costs. They have to be actual figures.
But yes, they have to be actual figures that you can trace back through timesheets or a similar mechanism into the company accounts. But effectively, if people are meaning by in-kind, the proportion of work that the company staff devote to this and its financial calculation as against the contribution of the grant, then that's fine. I think what Joe's pointing out there is it has to be traceable as real funding. It doesn't have to be cash brought in from an external source. Joe, you're looking doubtful about that.
Yeah, we don't tend to like the use of in-kind contributions in any way, really. We're just trying to avoid it. It's a bit of a buzzword for us.
Yeah, no, so I think everything has to be rendered as cash. It has to be realisable and measurable in cash terms.
Yeah.
Okay. Does the final product need to be a consumer paid for product or experience, or can there be alternative commercial models? It'd be really helpful if the person who submitted that perhaps came back and asked and suggested what alternative commercial models we might want to consider. Is there an expected minimum duration for public trials? Fiona?
Again, I think it's what do you need to do within a public trial to get you to the next point within your R&D process. So it's going to be project dependent, but I think we would want to see something that's realistic, that's at least industry standard, and is not just a shortcut towards getting you to where to filling in the blanks within the project. It's definitely an element of the project that needs to demonstrate value and demonstrate value well.
Okay, this is an interesting one because it's something that we've touched on, that we said that we will go back and produce a kind of worked example on. So if revenues from the project are deductible, are we talking about net contribution from revenue rather than gross revenue? So this revelation is totally fundamental. So I'm not sure that, I'd be worried if we're thinking that this is a revelation, but I do think that we need to actually work it through so that you've got some clear guidance. I mean, it has to be net. It couldn't be gross. That would be crazy. So it wouldn't. If there's revenue coming again in, we must be allowing people to set off the costs of the demonstration itself against those revenues, because otherwise it wouldn't be material. Does anybody want to either disagree with my controversial statement or agree with it?
That sounds right to me.
So
Andrew, I think. Sorry, we've also had a question about business models. The clarification was ad-funded business models.
I think that would be totally acceptable. Can't see a reason why not.
Yeah.
It's an exciting and different way of funding things. You don't have to tell tickets. So I think what we'll do with the revenue modelling thing is we need to go back and work through an example here, but I cannot imagine that the real answer to that would not allow you to deduct all the costs of serving up the experience. Can an immersive studio be involved in multiple consortiums applying for the fund? And it's consortia. So I think, yes, we've been really clear on that if you're not leading, you can be in as many consortia as you like. If you are leading, you can be a supplier into 2 others, I think is what we said. Are you going to award the total pot to just one consortium or distribute the funds across a number of demonstrators? Again, I think we've been reasonably clear that the least number of demonstrators we could fund would be 4 with the available funding. So that I'd assume 4 of them get the absolute maximum funding. So the least, whether the underlying this question is, are we going to fund 1 in each of the 4 areas? I think we've been clear that we think those 4 areas are each deserving of a demonstrator. But if nothing of sufficient quality comes through from one of those areas and there were 2 from another area, then we'd consider that. I hope I'm not making up policy on the hoof at that point. Okay, so sharpening the question, could match funding be things like in-kind support? We said no, unless you have to quantify things financially, or a business loan. To me, that could absolutely be, because that's cash funding. Other than state aid rules, are there any other rules applicable to the match? Yes, I think again we've covered some of those areas around match. So state aid is only one of the things. It has to be real. It has to be matched from does it have to be matched from the UK? It could be we could be drawing funds into these demonstrators from ex-UK, couldn't we? So there aren't any geographical limits on that. Would IP count as match funding? I think this is a really interesting question. So I think Fiona's indicated earlier that we would be anxious to see large payments proposed for IP licenses. Could people quantify the IP access and count that as match funding? What do you think?
I think that's a very interesting model, and I think we need to double check with Innovate on the technicalities of that being within scope.
I think the difficulty will be the quantification process, because we're talking about a newly emerging field where quantification of the rights, of the value of the rights, is difficult. So again, it would speak back to the methods and the solidity of that quantification to me. But let's go back and get a proper discussion on that. Does the grant only cover the creation of the demonstrator, or does it also provide for the delivery of the demonstration over time to the minimum 100,000 audience? Definitely the latter, I'd say. It's a requirement of the project proposal that you submit, that you reach that audience, and so we expect that to be funded from the budget. Right. Sorry, might have already been asked. The phasing of the audience numbers, 100,000 in one go versus 100,000 spread over 5 locations and 12 months, i.e., and I hope this doesn't give away where this is from, castles of Aberdeenshire, for instance. So 5 castles over 12 months. I think, again, it depends on your project, but again, I think how you plan to reach that 1,000, if it's different locations, it's over a different period. If that's right for you, Fiona, any?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're being overly ambitious with the 100,000, and it's not a massive big pole in the sand. I imagine that's the minimum we'd expect. Yes. And I think anything lower than that over longer periods of time would cause us to look into that in a bit more detail.
And I think it's helpful. So since this has been asked in a specific context, so perhaps it's useful to start thinking about what we'd expect from people. So if you're going to have 100,000 people experience this new immersive experience, so you're going to get your 100,000 audience, then if you're going to do it in 5 castles in Aberdeenshire over 12 months, then I guess what the assessors would want to provide confidence is, how many visitors go to those castles over that period? How many of those can you convert to experiencing this? Because it won't be all of them. And what's the technical rig and resources and all the other things that you're going to need to actually achieve that kind of conversion? And then people can assess whether that seems credible to deliver the 100,000 or not. Right. I'm just seeing, we've got a few more. I know we're running slightly over time. I understand if people want to drop off, but we'll just extend for maybe 5 minutes to answer some of these. Joe, Philip, really straightforward one. Can you confirm that higher than 30% of subcontracting is seen as a negative?
It's not seen as a negative, no. That's just a rule of thumb that we would use when we carry out our finance checks. But really, it depends on the nature of the sector. It depends on the nature of what you're actually looking to do as part of your project. So there is no real cap, and I wouldn't say officially that over 30% is going to negatively impact your chances in the competition.
I hear what you're saying. I think I'll leave it up to the audience to judge exactly what we all mean there. Can a digital publisher be the IP holder? I'm not quite sure I understand that question, which is probably me being very thick. But Fiona, any thoughts?
I think an IP holder is an IP holder, and that could be somebody who runs a golf team or somebody who's a digital platform. It depends if somebody can demonstrate they own the IP. Doesn't matter where it comes from.
Yeah, cool. That seems absolutely right to me. Is there a limit to international partners involved in a single consortia? What kind of balance between UK and international partners is expected?
I just want to go back to the point that the R&D has to take place in the UK, and the value of a large percentage of that value needs to stay in the UK. I would question if you'd want to get whether you would get a large group of international partners wanting to potentially come in on that basis, but you might get one or two who see real value in wanting to work with UK expertise and want to do the R&D here in the UK using UK expertise on the ground.
Yeah, and if international partners lead you to a route to for your demonstrator to be presented to international audiences, that sounds like a good thing. Yeah. But I think, Fiona, you're absolutely right to point out the difficulty of multiple international partners, particularly putting them together in the timescale. But we wouldn't see it necessarily as a negative. It's just it's a practical constraint. We've done the. We've answered the thing about one consortium and 4 million, or smaller grants to a number of consortia. So we, as we said, we've got 16 million. The minimum number of consortia we'd expect to fund is 4. It could be more if we don't get applications that ask for all the money. Read the IP cost and whether it's a cost that can be used as a match funding. Are you referring to the IP of the thing we're creating during the 2-year programme, or to the IP from the global brand that is part of the consortium delivering the project? I think we're referring to, all these conversations are referring to the latter. The value of the IP, the costs, the IP, the thing that you're creating is a different matter, and presumably we have to all accept that you start with that IP as being, there is no value at the start of the project. I'm not sure how you can use future IP value to generate match funding. Again, I think there's a worry there of a bit of overthinking. Working through these last couple, since the grant covers the operational delivery of the demonstrator, it's crucial to understand how revenue from the visitor experience will affect the grant. It's likely you will be discouraging consortia from charging because of the clawback on the grant. I think that's a really good question, and again speaks to our need to go away and do a work through example. I think we've just lost Fiona because her battery's just died. So I agree that it is absolutely crucial, and the answer we come back with must not discourage consortia from charging because it's effectively a clawback. And particularly, they must not discourage consortia from being successful. So I think we're going to go away and take that away. It is a thing that we've asked you all to, well, we certainly said is within scope. It's not compulsory to charge. So let us go away and think about that one. So the very last question, does it have to be a location-based immersive experience, or can it be personal digital use in the home? So the risk of me droning on, I think, again, it could be one or the other or both, depending on the proposition that you're trying to deal with. I think even in an area like visitor experience, you could imagine I suppose we could imagine a project where the innovation was happening by taking visitor experience into personal digital use in the home, but equally well it could be location based. So there is no expectation or requirement here. I think again, I'm sure we will get propositions that are looking to create experiences that can be where the audience can be both at home and on location, and we'll get some that will be one or the other. So there's no rules on that. Okay, sorry, we've run over about 15 minutes. Thanks for staying with it. I think we've hit on a couple of issues there that's been really helpful that we bottom out at this point. Obviously, that one about charging and how that works. I think the best thing for us to do would be to go back internally and produce a work-through example for you. As I've said, the commitment on my side is we mustn't discourage people from being successful or testing business models. So we'll bet that'll be a design feature of what we come back with. Thanks very much. We're open for business. Do contact us. Do let us know what you're thinking, if we can be of any help. And if not before, we will reconvene to do another one of these webinars on the, and I'm going to get this wrong, Sam, so I'm really hoping that you're going to send me a little message.
Thursday, the 28th of June at midday.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.